Brazil has emerged as one of the world's strongest economies and has expressed growing interest in supporting and taking part in the African development story. According to the World Bank, the country's economic growth, its success in narrowing social inequality and its development experience offer lessons for African countries. Joining us now to take a closer look at this, Lucy Corkin, country risk analyst at RMB. Lucy, thank you very much for joining us. Let's firstly take a kind of view of diplomatic relations between Brazil and Africa right now as a whole. If you could call Africa one whole, but still it is that. You've got the head of state, Dilma Rousseff now, who was the protege of the previous head of state, Lula. What has been their approach to the continent and doing business in Africa?
Well, Samantha, it was definitely Lula who put relations with Africa on the map in terms of Brazil's international relations. And you can see a definite uptick in relations with African countries from 2003 when Lula came to power. He actually made about 12 visits to African countries and visited 29 countries during his 3 terms and was essentially talking about the cultural heritage that African countries share with Brazil, but obviously there was a strategic political and economic agenda behind that. Dilma has continued his legacy, and in her first year she actually visited Angola, South Africa and Mozambique, which are 3 of the most strategic African countries for Brazil.
So very visible presence when it comes to leadership, and I suppose that in contrast to countries like America, where we haven't really seen Obama visiting Africa much. But that being said, let's talk about Brazil. Talk to us about, as you mentioned, the countries, the strategic countries that they're focused on right now.
Well, obviously, being a Portuguese-speaking country, Brazil has a natural advantage with Angola and Mozambique, which are 2 of our fastest-growing African countries as well. And even more importantly, the Brazilian companies, the strongest Brazilian companies, are found in the oil and gas, the construction, the mining sectors. And obviously, these are very strong sectors in terms of growth in both Angola and Mozambique. And then obviously, for various strategic reasons, South Africa is also a very important partner for Brazil.
Of course, a lot of similarities between Brazil and Africa. Exporters of minerals, exporters of agricultural produce. So what is Brazil bringing to the party when it comes to doing business in Africa? Are they bringing money? Are they bringing expertise? Are they bringing both?
Well, there are a couple of things. I think what's really interesting about Brazilian companies and what they've definitely emphasized is that particularly in countries like Angola and Mozambique, where there is considered to be quite a low level of local skills. Because they speak the language, it's much easier for them to basically foster this skills transfer. And this is particularly important in Angola, where Odebrecht, one of Brazil's biggest construction companies, is actually the largest private sector employer in that country. But a second point is also in terms of the technologies that they have brought along. Brazilian companies are very proud about saying how they've developed these technologies in a tropical environment, and this is very easily transferable to a lot of African countries in terms of its implementation.
Just looking at some of the countries on the list in terms of top Brazilian companies doing business in Africa, you've got Petrobras, and that of course the oil and gas, state-owned oil and gas producer, explorer, developer there. You've got Embraer, which in fact is an airline manufacturer, Vale, one of the world's biggest mining companies, and Electrobras, and they're a power utility, in fact the largest power utility in South America. So diverse in a way and bringing the much needed expertise that we need in the area of power generation. Of course, there's huge potential for the likes of Vale and huge coal mining projects in Mozambique.
Absolutely, but I think one of the most interesting sectors as well is that of construction. A lot of the really large companies, like I mentioned, Odebrecht, Camargo Correia, and André Gutierrez, they're also heavily involved in a large number of companies. A large number of countries, in Africa. I mentioned Angola and Mozambique, but they're also moving northwards, particularly into Francophone Africa as well.
Ghana is a country that also comes to mind when it comes to Vale, looking at potential new areas for mining. What are the issues that Brazilian companies have encountered in Africa? Have there been any challenges for them?
I think Brazilian companies, like a lot of other foreign investors coming to African countries, there's a range of issues that they experience that are quite similar. I think where Brazilian companies have been quite strategic is they have started off in areas where it would be a softer landing. So starting off with your Portuguese-speaking countries and then moving moving further along into other countries where there are definitely opportunities, but also high risk, as we know.
Almost luckily for them, these countries are some of the countries with the fastest growth rates in sub-Saharan Africa, so perhaps a lucky coincidence there. What about trade relations? Because we saw the overall trade between Africa and Brazil sitting at $27.6 billion in 2011, and that's of course from $4.3 billion in 2002, so it's a huge increase there. Are there opportunities to increase trade even further?
Very much so, and in fact one of the key strategic reasons for Brazilian companies coming to African countries is because they see African countries as a huge market. In fact, a lot, particularly in countries like Angola, in Egypt, in South Africa, a lot of manufactured goods are coming from Brazil into these countries, and increasingly they want to develop African countries as a market for these manufactured goods.
Is there likelihood that they'll move away from the mining, the construction you've talked about, the kind of oil and gas sector into more third economy, more tertiary economy type of sectors?
I think so. I mean, obviously the sectors like your construction, oil and gas and mining are your big ticket items. So whereas the volume might increase in terms of the manufactured goods, it's very likely that the mining sector is still going to dominate the headlines. Also, you have the possibility of Brazilian companies developing agribusiness. They've been incredibly successful in terms of converting Brazil from a net food importer to a net food exporter, and this is definitely something that we in Africa can learn from.
I think it was Angola recently getting a $2 billion loan, in fact, from Brazil to develop the agricultural sector, but we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for joining us today. Of course, fascinating insights into Brazil's involvement here on the African continent. That was Lucy Corkin, country risk analyst at RMB.